Hey guys, tonight we begin in a room where the fire never goes out. Let your thoughts settle now, as if placing them gently beside an old, familiar chair. The evening is quiet, and the soft crackling of the fire becomes the only voice that speaks. Imagine a library tucked deep inside a winter palace, far from the rush of time. Outside, snow falls in slow, steady patterns, brushing gently against tall windows and fading into the hush of the world beyond. Inside, a single candle flickers on the table beside you, casting soft golden shapes against the carved wood. Shadows stretch lazily across velvet drapes and centuries-old shelves, heavy with books whose spines have curled slightly with age. Tonight's story is not one of urgency or answers, but of curiosity wrapped in warmth. It drifts like steam from a teacup, with no destination but rest. This tale belongs to an emperor, a quiet figure whose days were marked not by wars or declarations, but by a strange little habit involving bread. Yes, just bread, baked fresh every morning, untouched by hands, and left to sit in silent corners of his many rooms. Why did he never eat it? Why must it always be there? These are not questions to be solved, only wondered at slowly, softly. Let's start by sinking into this quiet world, beginning with a single step through its most serene chamber. The library glows in soft, amber light, each flame dancing behind the glass of old lanterns. The scent of old parchment and lavender wax fills the room. An ornate pendulum clock ticks gently in the background, not to count the hours, but to remind us they are drifting past like snow outside the tall windows. This is where we begin, surrounded by stillness, wrapped in layers of velvet and time. The shelves rise high above, filled with bindings too fragile to open without whispering apologies. A breeze from the hearth dances through the pages of an open book resting nearby, its words dimmed by candlelight and softened by the passing years. Somewhere in the room, a wooden globe stands still, its continents outlined in gold, seas painted in faded blue. You might hear a distant creak, the sigh of old wood adjusting itself for the long winter evening ahead. Each object here has lived through years of silence, each corner rushed by quiet rituals. This was a room the emperor returned to often, though never in a hurry. His footsteps would echo lightly across the stone floor, softened by the long rugs woven in ochre and moss green. He would settle into a high-backed chair, facing the fire, his hands resting gently on the arms, as if they remembered the exact weight of comfort. Sometimes the emperor would not read at all. Instead, he would sit quietly, his gaze passing across the rows of books, then toward the flicker of the flames. The room seemed to listen to him, or perhaps it simply matched his stillness with its own. On a nearby table, always, rested a single loaf of bread on a porcelain tray, unsliced, untouched, with a thin crust dusted in flour. This was the ritual. A loaf placed without fail, fresh each morning and never eaten. The practice puzzled visitors, but none dared ask. Those who worked in the palace knew better than to question the small mysteries that filled its halls. Over time, the bread became part of the room's landscape, as familiar as the worn arm of a chair or the glint of brass on the fireplace tools. Now let your mind wander gently, tracing the golden light along the carved moldings. Let it drift up toward the corners of the ceiling, where painted angels stretch across faded frescoes. The silence is never heavy, only deep, a kind of soft quiet that settles like down across the surface of everything. And beyond the high windows, the snow continues to fall. In this winter palace, time has its own rhythm, unhurried and kind. The emperor's world was not filled with noise or command, but with layers of habit and intention. Every object placed, every action repeated, seemed to create a lullaby for the stone and wood around him. The bread, always there and never eaten, was part of that hush. You might imagine, just for a moment, the way light plays along the edges of the loaf, the way the crust cracks slightly as the warmth of the room finds its way in. You might imagine how, each day, a servant would walk these long halls with practiced steps, tray in hand, placing the bread with care. No words, no pause, just the act itself. And then the emperor would arrive, always later, never early. Not to eat, but to sit, to be present with the loaf, the light, the clock's slow beat, the hush of falling snow. Perhaps it was remembrance. Perhaps it was comfort, but mostly it was quiet. This story will not give you an answer, because it does not wish to. It only asks you to step into this quiet world and wander with it slowly. Like walking across an old rug in bare feet, tracing familiar patterns, hearing nothing but the fire's soft breath and the wood's old creak. The room does not end, it opens, like the story itself. Through a frosted window, a glimpse of garden paths appears, silvered by frost and edged in frozen lavender. The candle flickers slightly, as if aware of what comes next. And so we prepare to follow the emperor outside, into the pale morning light, where the gardens sleep beneath their blankets of white. Let's pause here, just for a moment longer. Let your eyes rest. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing to decide, nothing to expect. Just the knowledge that we are entering a story, told not in events, but in gestures. A story without climax, without conflict. Only a rhythm, gentle as the snow. The fire is steady. The bread is whole. And the emperor is already on his way down the corridor. We will follow him next, through the garden paths. The morning begins not with brilliance, but with a soft hush, a slow unfurling of gray-blue light across the frost-covered palace grounds. It is the kind of light that does not announce itself, but instead creeps in gently, as though not wishing to disturb anything still at rest. Outside the library's heavy doors, beyond the soft crackle of the fireplace and the golden flicker of candlelight, stretches the emperor's winter garden. It is quiet as always, and perfectly still, as if the very air has paused to observe. The emperor steps outside. His movements are unhurried, as though he has walked this path 1,000 times before, and will walk it 1,000 times again. He wears a heavy coat of velvet and wool, its hem brushing gently against the gravel. His gloved hands rest lightly behind his back, fingers clasped in a posture that is neither rigid nor slack, but simply ... steady. The paths of the garden are lined with rows of lavender, now dusted in frost and silver with the breath of winter. Once bright with color and fragrance, they are quiet now, folded into themselves like old letters. Above them, hedges stand precisely trimmed but softened by snow, their sharp geometry muted by the delicate weight of cold. Statues peer from alcoves, muses and nymphs and noble figures carved in stone, their expressions unreadable, their shoulders cloaked in white. The emperor's boots press into the gravel with a soft, rhythmic crunch. There is no rush to his step. The rhythm is part of the place itself. In a palace where time moves slowly, he moves with it, like a pendulum in perfect harmony with its clock. He pauses briefly to observe a climbing rose, its last bloom preserved in ice, petals tinged with pale pink beneath a glassy glaze. It is fragile and beautiful in its survival, and he honors it by noticing. Beyond the hedges, the topiary animals, deer, lions, a single swan, stand in solemn profile, dusted with morning frost. They are part of the landscape, never startling, always there, just like the emperor. Above, the sky is the color of faded parchment, pale and flat, with clouds moving slowly across it like drifting thoughts. A single crow caws once from the branches of a distant tree, and then falls silent. Around a gentle bend in the path, the faintest curl of smoke rises from a far chimney. It threads upward into the still morning, a gray ribbon from the kitchens where warmth is already building. There, beneath a trellis of bare vines, a servant waits. He is older than the others, wrapped in a heavy cloak of wool, and holds a porcelain tray. Upon it rests a single loaf of bread, freshly baked, its crust dusted with flour and the faintest sheen of steam rising from its surface. It is simple in appearance, almost plain. There is no garnish, no gold leaf, no fruit or adornment. Just bread. The servant places the tray gently on a marble pedestal and steps back. He does not bow. He does not speak. He simply fades away into the garden stillness, as he always does. The emperor passes the bread without a glance, though his awareness encompasses it fully. It is part of the ritual, and so is he. This daily walk, this offering left and never eaten, has become a point of gravity within the palace's silent orbit. The loaf rests undisturbed, a quiet symbol whose meaning is felt more than understood. His path loops again, past a line of bare cherry trees, their branches twisting like ink on pale parchment. A few flakes of snow begin to fall, thin and idle, drifting in the cold air without urgency. One lands on his sleeve, then disappears. Another catches on the tip of a hedgerow, glinting like glass. A gardener kneels beside a frozen fountain nearby. He is not working today, not truly. His bucket is empty. He has no tools, only a cloth in his hand and a slow, deliberate posture. He wipes frost from the edge of the stone basin, not to clean, but simply to be present. He does not acknowledge the emperor, nor is he expected to. Their silence is a shared space. Returning toward the palace, the emperor's footsteps continue, unbroken and calm. He passes beneath a stone arch where vines once bloomed with wisteria, now curled tight into winter's embrace. The hush of snow deepens. The palace, seen from this end of the garden, looks distant and monumental, its windows glowing softly in the dim light, reflecting nothing but the pale morning sky. Inside, beyond the glass, the candle in the library has burned just a little lower. Its wax pools at the base, slow and steady. The grandfather clock ticks softly, its pendulum keeping time not in seconds, but in breaths. The library awaits the emperor's return, its shelves filled with leather-bound books, each spine whispering of centuries past. But he does not hurry. Even the wind respects his pace. It moves gently through the garden, rustling the last brown leaves in the corners and carrying the faintest scent of baking bread toward the stone paths. As he reaches the final turn, he pauses once more beside a hedge shaped into the curve of a swan's neck. A patch of untouched snow rests at its base, soft and unbroken. Here, too, he always stops. The reason is unknown. Perhaps there is none. Perhaps this is simply where the walk ends. The emperor turns and begins to return. The garden behind him is unchanged, yet each step has altered it somehow. The footprints will fade, the snow will shift, the steam from the bread will cool, but the act remains. The walk was taken. The bread was placed. The world was witnessed, even in its quietest hour. And now, as the emperor approaches the doors once more, the fire inside waits for him. Its warmth curls against the windows like a beckoning hand. The candle still glows. The clock still swings. And in the kitchens, far away yet perfectly in tune, the baker prepares again. He does not know what the emperor thinks on these walks. He does not need to know. He only knows that each morning a loaf must be made, and each morning it is. In the next part of our story, we will step into that kitchen where warmth lingers in the air and flour dust dances in the first light of dawn. The morning quiet deepens within the palace walls, settling like a gentle hush over old stones and older memories. Somewhere within that hush, in a hallway that rarely sees more than a whisper of sound, a door opens with the faintest creak. A servant steps through, his movements fluid from long habit. His hands carry a silver tray, gleaming softly in the morning light, and upon it rests a single loaf of bread. Round, golden, and untouched by any knife, it sits as if posed for a painting, fresh from the oven yet destined never to be eaten. He walks through corridors veiled in silence, passing under gilded moldings and chandeliers that refract what little sunlight filters through frost-blurred windows. The loaf of bread gives off a subtle warmth, a faint aroma of flour and wood smoke, filling the air behind him like a breath held for centuries. He pauses at the end of a corridor. There on a pedestal shaped like a shallow bowl. He places the bread. He adjusts it slightly, not out of necessity, but out of care. Then he steps back, bows slightly to no one, and leaves without a sound. The bread will remain there all day. By evening, it will still be untouched. And the next morning, it will be replaced. No one questions this. No one interrupts the rhythm. For as long as anyone in the palace can remember, this has been the way. It is not an accident, nor an oversight. It is a practice, an expectation, perhaps even a ritual. The emperor, they say, does not eat the bread. He never has, and yet it must be made. It must be placed. It must be there. In another room, high in the west wing, another tray rests on another pedestal. Another loaf identical in appearance, though never in the details of crust or crumb waits there as well. In total, 5 loaves are placed each day. In the garden, in the hallway near the music room, at the foot of the library stairs, beside the chair in the emperor's writing chamber, and once, always once, in the blue and gold salon at the top of the South Tower. No one is ever found eating them. They are never sliced, never nibbled by mice or touched by hand. At the end of the day, they are removed, and the process begins again. There are those who remember when the tradition first began. Or rather, they remember their predecessors speaking of it in tones low and reverent around the long kitchen table in the servants' quarters. But even those memories are faded now, worn thin like old parchment. Some believe the emperor once tasted the bread, long ago, before a season of mourning, or perhaps a moment of reflection. Others say he never did, that the bread is not for consumption, but for memory, or silence, or time itself. The servants who place the bread do not speak of it, not from fear or obedience, but from understanding. It is not their place to question. It is their place to continue. In a world where much has changed, where ministers have come and gone, where empires have risen and dwindled, the bread remains. And so it must. At the end of the hallway, a young maid polishes the marble edge near one of the pedestals. Her cloth moves slowly, in circular motions, worn smooth from years of repetition. She glances at the loaf once, briefly. It is beautiful in its own quiet way. The crust is crisp, but not brittle. The color is even, a warm tone that falls somewhere between amber and gold. It is still faintly warm, and for a fleeting second, she imagines what it might taste like. But she does not touch it. She continues polishing, and the moment passes. Later in the day, a butler passes through the same corridor. He notes the bread in his periphery, nods to it without looking, and moves on. There is a sort of comfort in its presence, like the steady rhythm of the clocks, or the way the light lands on the same windowsill every afternoon at 3. It anchors the day. It completes the shape of time. In the kitchen, where the day began and where it will end, the baker has already moved on to preparing tomorrow's loaves. His apron is dusted with flour. His hands, large and deliberate, knead dough with the precision of someone who has done this every morning for decades. He does not wonder why the bread is not eaten. That was a question for his younger self, long ago. Now the act of baking is enough. Each loaf is unique, though the recipe never changes. A simple blend of flour, water, a touch of salt. The yeast is cultivated in-house, a strain passed down through generations. The oven is ancient, stone-lined, and always warm. He knows exactly how long each loaf should rest, how much heat it needs when it's ready to cool. There is a kind of peace in that, a peace in knowing your place in the quiet machinery of a world so large, so old. Back in the palace's upper halls, The light begins to shift as clouds roll over the winter sky. Shadows stretch a little longer. Candles are relit. A fire is stoked in the music room, though no one plays today. The bread, still resting, seems to glow slightly in the softened light. It holds its place like a sentinel of something forgotten, or perhaps something too subtle to explain. The emperor walks past one of the loaves in the early afternoon. He does not stop. He does not speak. But his eyes fall on it briefly, and in that glance is something beyond observation. A kind of acknowledgement, as if the bread were a word unspoken between old friends. As if the daily ritual, in its silence, spoke enough. Evening falls slowly. The lamps are lit one by one, casting long reflections on the palace floors. The loaves remain untouched, just as they have for so many days before. Their crusts cool, their steam fades, their purpose unchanged. When the last bell chimes at the hour of rest, a quiet pair of hands retrieves the bread. Carefully, gently. It is not discarded rudely. It is not thrown away. Some loaves are taken to the compost in the winter garden. Others are fed to birds in the courtyard at dawn. One is given to the cathedral's cloister, where the sisters crumble it for the deer that wander in from the woods. But never is it eaten by a human hand. That is not what it is for. And so the day ends. A loaf placed, a loaf removed. A quiet act, repeated without question. Its meaning is not declared. Its story half whispered. But the presence of that bread, unbroken and uneaten, is as essential to the palace as the very stones beneath its floors. Beneath the west wing of the palace, down a gently curving corridor lined with pale stone and shaded tapestries, rests the oldest room in the emperor's winter domain, a library seldom visited by guests and never disturbed by noise. It is a sanctuary tucked beneath the rhythm of court life, a place where time is not marked by clocks, but by the fading of candlelight and the slow settling of dust. The doors are thick and carved, bearing no markings but age, and they swing open without a sound. Inside, the library breathes quietly. The air is tinged with the scent of parchment and old leather, with a faint whisper of beeswax and ink. Rows upon rows of shelves stretch to the vaulted ceiling, their wooden spines bowed slightly with the weight of centuries. Books of every shape and color fill the space, not in a manner of display, but in quiet residency. Each one appears to have settled into its place long ago and grown comfortable there. The emperor enters with the same stillness he carried through the garden. His steps make no sound on the time-worn wooden floor. A shaft of cold daylight filters in through the high, narrow windows, illuminating the air like a gentle mist. Dust motes drift slowly through the beam, dancing on invisible currents. Nothing in this room hurries. Nothing needs to. He does not rush to any one shelf. Instead, he walks the perimeter first, fingers lightly trailing along the edge of a sideboard. The surface is smooth but not polished, softened by years of touch and temperature. A globe rests nearby, its oceans faded to gray-blue, and its countries etched in elegant script. It is not current. It does not need to be. Its purpose is not navigation, but reverie. At the far end of the room, a spiral staircase of blackened iron coils upward toward a narrow mezzanine. The stairs creak softly as he climbs, not as a complaint, but as a greeting. At the top, a small desk awaits, tucked against a circular window. A single candlestick rests upon it, the wax cooled in a ring from a previous flame. The emperor sits. His coat folds neatly behind him, and his hands rest on the table for a moment before moving toward a particular shelf. He pulls down a book with a cracked spine. It is bound in dark green leather, its corners rounded by use. He places it on the desk and opens it slowly. The pages are handwritten lines of fine, sloping calligraphy rendered in sepia ink. Margins bear small annotations, some barely legible. The book is not signed. Its author is unknown. Its date is uncertain. But the emperor knows it well. It is a manuscript of culinary notes, part journal, part recipe, part meditation. It begins with reflections on flour, the way it behaves in different air, the sound it makes when sifted, the texture of wheat ground by hand. Further in, it describes bread's crusts that crack like ice underfoot, crumb that yields like snow. Some entries are technical. Others are poetic. One page simply reads, "To bake is to remember the warmth of the sun in the grain." The emperor reads slowly. He is not seeking knowledge. He is revisiting a feeling. The words do not pass through his eyes and vanish. They stay with him, accumulate gently like layers of dough resting under cloth. He turns each page carefully, his fingers practiced and patient. Further along, a passage notes a peculiar tradition from the southern coast, a local ruler who insisted that fresh bread be baked every day but never served. It was to be placed on his breakfast table, whole and untouched, and removed each evening. No one ever saw him eat it. The practice was passed down, unquestioned, a quiet ritual of presence rather than consumption. The emperor pauses here, his eyes lingering on the inked words. He has read this story many times. He never marks the page, never dog-ears it. He always finds it again. Below the mezzanine, the main floor of the library holds tables covered in linen cloths and stacks of books too fragile to shelve. A pair of dusty armchairs sit facing a fireplace, long since bricked up. On one table lies a large ledger, open to a page covered in ornate flourishes and aged parchment yellowed to the shade of butter. In one corner, a wooden chest remains locked. Its key is kept elsewhere. No one remembers what is inside. It rests there like a sealed memory, respected and unbothered. A small painting hangs above it, a still life of a table with bread, cheese, and grapes. The brush strokes are soft, the light gentle. It is not signed either. Near the entry, an ancient clock ticks in slow rhythm. Its chime is muffled by distance, but the sound reaches the emperor like a familiar echo. He closes the green book and returns it to the shelf. His hand rests on its spine for a moment before withdrawing. He descends the stairs. The light has shifted slightly warmer now, as if the morning has exhaled. The dust continues its descent in slow spirals. On a nearby table sits another book, thinner than the first, its cover embossed with a golden sheaf of wheat. He does not open it. He simply notes its presence, the way one might glance at a flower blooming in the corner of a field. As he prepares to leave, he does not look back. The room, like the garden, holds its shape without needing his attention. It will remember him regardless. The door closes behind him with a sigh of air. Back in the corridor, a servant carries a tray of books wrapped in cloth. He moves slowly, deliberately, his steps careful not to disturb the hush. The emperor nods faintly in passing a gesture of acknowledgement, not instruction. Their exchange is wordless, and yet complete. Outside, the day has softened. The frost remains on the windowsills, but the sky glows with a faint warmth. Somewhere, a bell tolls a single low note that echoes briefly and is gone. The emperor continues his walk. In the quiet of the palace archives, tucked between ledgers of taxation and treatises on trade, lie pages dedicated to bread. Not in excess or abundance, but with the careful reverence of something small made sacred. The emperor, though he never touched a crumb, knew these pages well. He had read them in silence, candlelight flickering over his shoulder, as though afraid the words might scatter like flour dust. The records were written in neat lines, lists, notes, and little sketches of loaves. No battles or decrees, only bread. A empire, vast and stretching across mountains and rivers, produced many kinds of bread. In the northern provinces, dense rye loaves with dark crusts and the bitter perfume of caraway-filled village ovens. In the southern towns, soft rolls were pulled fresh from wood-fired kilns, perfumed with olive oil and rosemary. On the western coast, Fishermen's wives baked flat cakes for long voyages, salted and firm. In the East, Highland bakeries sent down braided loaves, golden and fine, each one a small celebration of morning. Each region had its own recipe, a slow ritual shaped by hand and season. These were not grand feasts or royal platters. They were daily things, things to cradle in cloth, things to offer without words. The emperor read of them all. He knew the distinctions, the flour ratios, the cooling times. He had never tasted them, but he understood them. Or perhaps he understood what they meant. Each loaf, like a letter, carried a whisper of place and time. The palace kitchens kept their own record. One thin book, bound in buckskin and stained with age, lay near the hearth. In it, generations of bakers had scrawled observations in curling script. The quality of wheat one year, the burnished color of a well-baked crust, the preferences of those long gone. In the margin of one page was a curious note, dated decades earlier. He only ever asks to see them, never to eat. The handwriting was old, the ink faded to a pale brown. The note sat beneath a sketch of a round loaf with a cross scored on top. There were no more words, no explanation. Just that one sentence and the quiet implication of a habit kept. And so the palace bakers continued. They rose before the sun, lit the ovens, and followed the recipes. Every morning, one loaf was shaped, baked, and placed on the tray. The ingredients were simple: flour, water, salt, and thyme. No yeast was needed. The dough rested overnight and rose on its own. The process, though unspoken, was precise. The loaf must be warm, but not hot, dusted with flour, but not cracked. It must rest on porcelain, never silver. The loaves were never eaten, not by the emperor, nor by anyone else. But they were not wasted. By sunset, they disappeared, removed quietly by hands that knew not to ask. Where they went, no one said. Some whispered they were given to the poor. Others believed they were returned to the earth beneath the garden. Perhaps neither was true. Perhaps the removal was part of the ritual, like sweeping ash from a hearth. The emperor never acknowledged them directly. But there was a kind of gravity to the bread's presence. Guests noted it. Foreign dignitaries glanced at the tray, then quickly looked away. Servants came to regard the loaf as part of the room, like a vase or a clock. It was always there, and so, like time itself, it became invisible through repetition. When the emperor walked, the loaf awaited him. When he read, it sat nearby. When he retired to his study, it remained in the corner, on a pedestal or side table, silent and whole. It was never moved once placed. No one dusted it or straightened its cloth. It was complete as it was. In the writings of a court scribe, found later among forgotten pages, there was mention of a banquet. A winter feast of rare opulence, with foreign spices in silver goblets and 1,000 candles. The scribe noted that the emperor smiled politely throughout, made no comment on the courses, and left before dessert. On the next morning, as always, the loaf of bread appeared in his study. Alone, untouched, precisely made. It was as though the bread had become something else entirely. Not food, but form. Not nourishment, but memory. It belonged not to the stomach, but to the rhythm of days. A constant presence, small and unchanged, in a world that shifted with season and war and time. Occasionally, the head baker would consult the archives. He would turn the thin pages and study the sketches. His fingers would trace the line of a crust, the dotted notes beside a loaf's height. There was comfort in the repetition, in knowing that his task today was the same as the task decades ago. The loaves did not evolve. They remained exactly what they were. And that, in a way, was their purpose. In a private letter never sent, the emperor once wrote, "There is something calming in knowing that each day something is made only to exist, not to be used, not to be consumed, simply to be." No one read that letter and it was found sealed in a drawer long after his time. But it echoed quietly in the rituals of the palace. In the way the tray was polished, in the way the baker tied his apron, in the way the loaf sat, steam curling into silence, every morning without fail. And so the kingdom's bread lived not on the table, but in presence, in the quiet corners of rooms, in the pause of a glance, in the soft memory of hands that shaped it. The loaves, like the empire, endured without needing to explain themselves. As this chapter of our story closes, the loaf rests again in its place. The porcelain tray gleams. The bread is warm. The emperor, elsewhere in the palace, is already turning a page. And tomorrow, it will be made again, just as it always has been. In the next part of our story, we'll explore how each room in the palace held a different light and scent, and how silence, like bread, became part of the daily ritual. The palace is a place where sound moves gently, like dust in a shaft of light. Each room holds its own quiet, its own mood. The window is slightly ajar, letting in a narrow stream of morning air. The desk is vast and largely untouched. Quills lie arranged in a row. A candle has burned halfway down and leans slightly in its holder. The fire in the hearth is reduced to embers, but it glows with a determined persistence. The great dining hall echoes slightly with each step, though the rugs have long since softened the stone beneath. Gilded mirrors reflect pieces of the room. A candle here, a tapestry there. Bread is placed here too, under a glass dome that no one lifts. In this hall of muted grandeur, the emperor's presence barely registers in the air, yet the room acknowledges him all the same. The only sound is the gentle ticking of a clock on the mantel, its chime muffled, its rhythm sure. It is replaced each day, fresh, warm, and whole. The servants perform this task with reverence and calm. They never question, never comment. They place each loaf precisely, always on porcelain, always in silence. The act is a ritual of care, like lighting a candle or winding a clock. It is done for the sake of doing. This room is quieter still, a chamber for thought. The hush that surrounds him is not empty. It is filled with the soft presence of place, memory, and repetition. The windows here are tall and wide, and outside the garden lies still, its frost glinting in midday sun. He stands beside the window for a long moment, watching the snow drift in slow spirals beyond the glass. Behind him, the rooms remain quiet. The bread remains untouched. The silence holds. And somewhere, not far from here, the next loaf is being prepared, its crust crackling softly as it cools in the kitchen air. The warmth here is gentle, like sun through cloth. A loaf of bread waits on a table by the window. Steam no longer rises from it, but it remains whole, complete. In this rhythm, there is comfort. In this repetition, there is meaning. Though no words are spoken, the story is still being told. The emperor once spent long hours here, or so the servants say, though no one recalls what he did. There is no ink, no book, no chessboard left behind. Just the warmth of the fire and the faint perfume of time. It brushes against the drapes, making them sway in a motion so gentle, it's barely there. It glistens faintly in the flickering firelight. No one dares to touch it. The rules are not spoken, but they are understood. The bread must always be there. The presence of bread in each room has become as expected as the tick of the grandfather clock, as the sway of the tapestries in the winter air. The curtains are thick, embroidered with vines and acanthus leaves, and their edges are worn from sunlight and time. The scent is of starch and lavender, pressed cloth and powdered wigs. A valet once stood here each morning, but now the emperor dresses alone, not out of pride, but because the process has become part of his morning ritual, part of the slow, reflective rhythm of palace life. Bread rests here too, beside a folded pair of gloves, as if to bless the day's beginning. The walls hold paintings of fruit in bowls, each one slightly faded, the fruit eternal, the bowls unbroken. In the room of maps, where oceans are drawn in faded blues and borders penned in gold, the emperor stands for a while. The paper is old, the ink softened by time. Here, the silence is wide and deep, like the plains the maps depict. The bread lies near the compass rose, as if marking the way to something never quite reached. Some silence feels warm, like a woolen blanket in winter. Other silence feels cool and still, like a marble floor at dawn. As the emperor passes from one room to the next, the hush never breaks. Instead, it shifts in tone and color, like the soft gradation of candlelight on old wallpaper. In the breakfast room, the scent of baked bread lingers, though no one is eating. Down the hall, in the emperor's private study, the air smells faintly of ink and varnished wood. Each room carries a scent as if memory clings to its corners. In the music room, there is the subtle hint of old strings and lacquer. No one plays here anymore, but the silence remembers. In the corridor outside, the hush becomes deeper, the kind of silence that makes a person walk more slowly. Even the footmen, posted like statues at the far ends of these halls, shift their weight as if reluctant to disturb the air. The emperor steps into the gallery where the morning light is filtered through pale silk curtains. It touches the floor in long gold streaks, illuminating the path ahead. On a side table near the window rests another loaf of bread, identical to the one in the garden, still untouched. It sits on porcelain, beside a folded linen napkin. The display is neither indulgent nor functional. It simply exists, a quiet offering, a repetition, a part of the palace's quiet breath. No room is empty in spirit, even when unoccupied. In a smaller chamber, where velvet chairs face each other around a fireplace, the flame crackles gently, releasing a scent of seasoned oak and dried herbs. On a nearby sideboard sits yet another loaf. This one is smaller, rounder, with a darker crust. In the dressing room, lit by tall windows facing east, the silence is drier. Every room has its loaf, its hush, its light. There is no explanation, and none is needed. The bread is not consumed. It is not moved. The emperor walks through the rooms like a reader turning the pages of a book. Nothing is rushed, nothing ignored. He ends his walk in the solarium, where the light is strongest though still subdued. The emperor does not sit. Long before the palace stirs, before the frost has melted from the windows or the birds have begun their quiet songs, there is a warmth already flickering in a small building tucked beside the main kitchen. It is not grand. Its roof slopes gently under the weight of snow, and its windows fog from within. This is the baker's corner, a place of steady motion, fragrant air, and quiet repetition. Inside, the walls are lined with shelves holding sacks of flour, glass jars of spices, bundles of dried herbs tied with string. Wooden spoons hang from hooks. A long table stretches beneath a narrow window, and on it rests a mixing bowl, large and worn, its rim darkened by years of use. The baker, an elderly man with silvered hair and hands like worn leather, has already begun his task. He does not speak as he works. He rarely does. Words are not needed in this space where everything has a place and a rhythm. He moves with slow precision, measuring with his eyes, kneading by feel rather than weight. The dough is soft and elastic beneath his touch, warm from the heat of his palms. He presses it down, folds it over, presses again like a breath, like a heartbeat. He does not question the ritual. Each morning, a single loaf is made. It is shaped with care, scored gently across the top, and brushed with a bit of water. It is placed into a shallow tray and carried to the oven built into the stone wall. The fire within has already been lit, its coals glowing softly. Fed hours before by his own hand, the baker watches the loaf as it begins to rise. He listens to the slight hiss of moisture against heat, the whisper of crust forming. He inhales deeply the smell of flour and flame, familiar and grounding. He does not wonder why the bread is never eaten. That is not his concern. His concern is that it is made, and that it is made well. A young assistant, perhaps no more than 15, sits quietly in a corner. He does not yet work, but watches. He mimics the old man's motions with invisible dough in his lap, whispering each step to himself. The baker does not correct him. Time will do that. Time and the patience to wait. Outside, the snow presses softly against the window panes. Inside, the baker moves to another table, where he begins to dust a fresh cloth with flour. He lifts the risen loaf from the oven with a flat wooden peel, its bottom crisp, its top golden. It is not a grand loaf, not ornate or extravagant, but its simplicity is a kind of beauty, shaped by routine. He sets it on the cloth, folds the corners over gently, and allows it to rest. A few moments of stillness. The bread steams faintly, as if sighing. The baker leans back against the counter and closes his eyes for just a breath or two, the warmth of the oven radiating against his skin. His back aches, but it is a familiar ache, one earned by years of gentle work. A bell rings faintly in the distance, not a call to action, but a signal, a reminder that the palace is waking. He reaches for the porcelain tray, smooth and cool, to the touch. He places the loaf upon it, unadorned, unspoken for. It is ready. The assistant rises and opens the door. A gust of cold air enters, stirring the warmth and carrying it into the garden beyond. The baker follows, stepping carefully along the flagstones. His boots crunch on the frost. The tray does not tremble in his hands. He has walked this path so many times, it has become a part of him. He reaches the marble pedestal near the trellis, just as he has every morning. He places the tray there, centering it gently. He does not wait. He does not look around. He simply turns and walks back, leaving the bread behind. That is the way it is done. Always. Back in the kitchen, the assistant sweeps a bit of flour from the floor. The baker sits with a cup of warm water and honey, cradled in both hands. He stares into the steam, not lost in thought, but content in the absence of it. The day will continue. He will clean the tools, prepare the next batch of dough. But for now, he is still. The boy asks, barely above a whisper, why the bread is never eaten. The baker smiles faintly. He does not answer, not because he does not know, but because the answer is not his to give. Instead, he says, the bread is its own purpose. And with that, he rises, stretching slowly, and begins to scrub the mixing bowl. The air is warm with the scent of the loaf, even now resting untouched in the garden. Through the window, the sky begins to lighten. The first hints of sunrise brush the snow with color. The baker's work is not finished, but this part of the ritual is complete. In a palace of endless chambers and silent halls, the baker's corner remains unchanged. A place of fire and flour, of needed patience and unsaid devotion. The bread will cool, and tomorrow it will be made again. No matter the weather, no matter the question, the bread will be made, and in the next part of our story, we will return to the great halls, where the clocks keep their gentle rhythm and tiny crumbs begin to appear without sound or reason upon trays that were never touched. The palace rose each morning with a quiet that was more ritual than routine. Long before the sun had fully warmed the frosted glass panes, before voices stirred and steps echoed along the marble halls, a loaf of bread would already be resting on its porcelain tray. The act was simple, repeated so precisely that it seemed to belong more to time itself than to any one person. The tray sat upon a small side table near the emperor's private quarters, its surface warmed faintly by a slant of early light. No one ever watched it being placed. It simply appeared at precisely 6 in the morning. The great clock near the east wing chimed with its long, mellow tone. It did not clang or ring, but offered instead a gentle announcement to the still air, as if bowing to the morning. The sound spread slowly across the polished floors and coffered ceilings, flowing like warm water through the palace's stone veins. Those awake would note the hour without moving. Those asleep would not stir. Beneath it, the bread sat quietly. A presence neither explained nor questioned. The curious part was not the bread's arrival. That had long been part of the palace's rhythm. What puzzled those few who were observant enough to notice was the appearance of crumbs. Tiny, nearly imperceptible specks of crust or flour, often scattered just beside the loaf or caught along the edge of the tray. They were not placed there. The kitchen staff swore to the cleanliness of the delivery. The tray was always wiped, the bread handled with gloved hands. And yet, there they were, delicate traces, like whispers left behind. The staff noticed, but they did not speak of it. The older servants remembered when the trays were always clean. The younger ones learned quickly to mirror the silence. Some began to wonder if the crumbs were perhaps a sign of change, though nothing else seemed to shift. The emperor walked as he always did. The rooms remained still. Yet somehow, the presence of those faint crumbs introduced the smallest tremble into the palace's seamless routine. One morning, a housemaid lingered just a moment longer after placing the tray. The corridor was empty, the light weak and bluish. She told herself she was only pausing to adjust her apron. But her eyes drifted to the loaf. She thought she saw the faintest puff of flour settle as if from an invisible breath. A trick of the morning air, perhaps. She did not stay to watch further. No one ever did. The clocks, too, seemed to mark the moment. Not just the large one in the east wing, but the smaller ones, the grandfather clocks, the pocket watches resting on mantels, even the ornate timepiece in the emperor's study. All of them chimed in staggered harmony, each a second or two apart. The palace moved not by precision, but by the slow, forgiving rhythm of memory. Time did not rule here. It floated in the kitchen. The baker had noticed the crumbs as well. Not because he saw them, but because he stopped seeing the loaf come back untouched. For many years, the bread had returned exactly as it had left, warm, whole, and left to cool again in silence. But lately, small differences began to appear. A corner just slightly less sharp. A crust not quite as round. These were not errors in baking. These were impressions, not from teeth or hands, but from time itself. He never asked questions. He simply made the next loaf. The kitchen clock was the only one that ran slightly fast. No one corrected it. In fact, its speed was barely noticeable, perhaps only a minute or two ahead. But the baker adjusted his movements to match it. The hands of that clock seemed to guide the rhythm of flour, yeast, water, and warmth. In the quiet, it was said the minute hand clicked forward not with sound, but with scent. The instant the dough began to rise, the minute had passed. Elsewhere in the palace, the emperor would often pause when the clocks chimed, not in recognition of the hour, but in acknowledgement of the sound. He would be standing by a window, or near a hearth, or halfway down a corridor. The sound of the chime reached him like a wave, soft and slow. Sometimes he would close his eyes, just for a second, just enough to hear the full note fade into silence. On certain days, when the morning was especially still, one could hear the crumb. That is to say, the sound of a single fragment falling, a soft tick, lighter than paper, almost impossible to detect. It would land upon the porcelain tray with the gentlest sigh of sound, only to vanish again into stillness. Was it real? Or imagined? It hardly mattered. The palace was full of such phenomena, real only if you wished them to be. A footman once tried to sweep the tray more carefully, but the next morning the crumbs were there again. And on the morning after that, a slightly larger one had appeared. He stopped interfering after that. In some places, a mystery is not meant to be solved. It is meant to be carried. The emperor never commented. He never gave instruction about the crumbs. But once, many years ago, a visiting noble had inquired, casually over dinner, about the bread. The emperor had looked up not with annoyance, but with a kind of absent amusement, and said only, "It is for time to eat." No one ever asked again. The crumbs continued to appear. Not every day, but often enough to be noticed. Some thought it was the emperor himself, rising in the dark to taste a piece in secret. Others whispered of ghosts, or memories so strong they left marks upon the present. But the truth remained silent, folded somewhere between the bread, the clock, and the air that filled the rooms it dawned at, and so the palace kept its rhythm. The loaf was placed, the crumbs appeared, and the clock chimed. As always, nothing more was needed. The pattern was enough. In a world that seldom changed, the smallest shifts became sacred. The act of placing, the sound of ticking, the presence of a single crumb, these were not oddities. They were comforts. Tomorrow, as every day, the bread would return to the tray. Whether untouched, nibbled, or gently altered, no one could say. But it would be there, as it always had been. The clock would chime, as it always had. And perhaps, just perhaps, another small crumb would rest there quiet and undisturbed, waiting to be seen, or not seen at all. The morning had slipped into a gentle drizzle by the time the palace began to stir. Rain tapped softly against the high windows, creating a rhythm that required no attention. The sky, a dull pewter, cast a hush over everything it touched. The usual golden glow of dawn was muted, as though nature had drawn a curtain of silver mist across the day. In this light, the stones of the palace darkened, and the world seemed to press inward dot in the emperor's chambers. The fire had been lit earlier than usual. Its low crackle barely competed with the soft hiss of rain on the sills. The logs burned slowly, casting elongated shadows that trembled faintly across the tapestry-lined walls. Outside the windows, the garden was a blur of dripping hedges and bowed lavender, their scent made more pungent by the damp. The fountain at the center of the courtyard had ceased its movement, its pool stilled by the persistent fall of rain. The emperor sat near the window in a tall carved chair, not quite looking out, but not reading either. His hands were still, resting gently on the arms of the chair. He seemed to listen to the rain, or perhaps to something quieter within it. His gaze hovered somewhere beyond the glass, unfocused and soft. Time in the room thinned, stretched out like a thread, pulled gently between two fingers. On the table, nearby, the usual loaf of bread rested undisturbed. Its crust was slightly darker that morning, baked just a few minutes longer than usual. Moisture from the air clung to the porcelain tray, forming tiny beads along the rim. One drop, heavier than the others, traced a slow path downward before settling into stillness. In the corridor, a slow, steady dripping echoed like a far-off metronome. The sound came from the stone arches that framed the hallway, where water found its way through centuries-old seams and collected in silent pools. Servants moved gently through the halls, their footsteps muffled by the thick rugs and the thickening hush. No one hurried. There was no need. The bread remained untouched well past mid-morning. A footman passed by, glanced at it briefly, and continued, on without breaking stride. The loaf did not call attention to itself. It had never needed to. Like the rain, it simply was a part of the day, a note in the quiet song the palace sang to itself. By afternoon, the rain had deepened into a steadier fall. The windows no longer dripped, but streamed, long ribbons of water trailing across the panes like slow tears. The light dimmed further, turning the interior of the palace into a shadowed echo of itself. Candles were lit in some of the darker corridors. their flames flickering with a kind of tentative confidence. The emperor did not move from his seat. His posture, though relaxed, held a quiet attentiveness, as though he were waiting for something unspoken. Perhaps not a visitor, or a word, but a feeling. The rain, steady as breath, seemed to deepen the space around him. The fire crackled softly. Now and then, a log shifted, releasing a faint sigh of smoke and pine. On this day, something unusual happened. The bread, so often left pristine, had been touched not by hand, not by teeth, but by the rain. A thin line of water had crept in through a misaligned window frame, trailing down the edge of the wall, and pooled at the base of the table leg. There, it had begun to soak upward into the tray. A small crescent of the loaf's edge was dampened. The crust softened and darkened by the moisture. The emperor's gaze drifted toward it. He did not move to intervene. He simply looked, his face unreadable in the half-light. For a long moment he regarded the dampened bread as if trying to remember whether it had ever been otherwise. Then his eyes returned to the window. Outside, the garden paths were now ribbons of mud. The lavender hung heavy with rain. Statues stood with stoic patience, their stone robes slick and shining. The fountain, usually graceful in its arc, had become a silent basin, catching drops with no motion of its own dot in the kitchens. The baker had not changed his rhythm. He had not seen the rain. He had only felt the change in pressure, the way flour clung differently to his fingers that morning, the way the dough rose just a bit slower. He kneaded with the same steady movements, not noticing the storm, not needing to. The rain belonged to the palace now. By late afternoon, the loaf still rested on the tray. The damp had spread no further. A slight indentation had formed along its side, but no one touched it. A housemaid, entering to tend the fire, noticed the change. She paused. Her gaze met the emperor's for the briefest instant. Nothing was said. She left the room without a word. As dusk approached, the rain softened. Its sound faded to a whisper, a mere suggestion of water against stone. The fire burned lower, a bed of coals pulsing softly. Shadows shifted as the candlelight took prominence. The bread remained where it had been placed, its surface now a little more weathered, a little more real. The emperor remained in his chair until the last of the daylight vanished. He stood only once to walk to the hearth. He placed a hand on the mantel, perhaps for warmth, perhaps for memory. He looked once more at the loaf, then at the window. Then he returned to his seat. By evening, the palace was wrapped in silence. The rain had stopped. Only the smell of damp stone remained. The loaf of bread, changed only slightly by the days. Weather seemed now part of the room in a new way, not just placed there, but absorbed into it. A part of the silence, a part of the rain. In the morning, a fresh loaf would appear as always. But this one would remain in memory, not because it was different, but because it had endured, because it had felt the rain. Long before the morning fires were lit, while the palace still slept beneath its heavy velvet silence, a baker entered his kitchen. He moved with the same quiet precision each day, navigating the familiar darkness without need of a candle. The embers in the oven gave off a dim orange glow, painting long shadows across the stone floor. He tied his apron, brushed flour from a wooden table, and began his work, not rushed, not slow, but as if keeping time with something older than clocks. In the corner, near a worn wooden shelf stacked with sacks of grain and jars of spice, stood a large tin box coated with a fine layer of flour. The box was old, dented at one side, with a lid that creaked when lifted. It hadn't been opened in years, perhaps decades. It sat there, not hidden, but untouched, blending into the kitchen, as naturally as the walls themselves. Only the baker knew what was inside, and he never said. That morning, something made him pause. He stood before the box, his hand resting on the lid. The kitchen was unusually quiet, no drip of water from the basin, no stirring of mice behind the walls, not even the distant tick of the hallway clock. He opened the box. Inside lay a letter. It was wrapped in coarse cloth, browned with age and tied with a thin ribbon. The envelope had no seal, only a single line written in a careful, looping hand. To be opened when there is no more bread. The baker smiled faintly. He did not touch the letter. He merely brushed away the layer of flour that had settled on top, then closed the lid again. He returned to his dough. The memory of the letter lingered in the warm air of the kitchen, like the scent of something once baked. The flour swirled softly as he worked, rising in faint clouds around his hands. The bread that morning would be rye, its crust dark and glossy, shaped with an old wooden mold passed down from his teacher. He kneaded the dough slowly, with even pressure, as if shaping not just bread, but time itself. No one else knew about the letter. Not the scullery boys, nor the maids who passed through the kitchen to warm their hands at the oven. The letter had been placed there long before they arrived, back when the baker's hair was still brown, and the emperor still spoke more often than he watched. It had always waited. There were days when the baker thought of reading it. On winter mornings when the bread rose slowly, or in spring when the scent of lilac made the kitchen feel softer. But he never did. The words were meant for a moment that had not yet come, a silence more complete than any he had yet known. That morning, as the dough began to rise, he paused again by the tin. He did not open it. Instead, he wiped away the new dust that had settled on the lid, polished the edges with the side of his sleeve, and gave a small nod as though to the memory inside or the person who had written it. Elsewhere in the palace, the great clock chimed its slow progression. Servants moved quietly through the corridors. Curtains stirred in gentle draughts. The emperor's loaf was already on its tray, the porcelain slightly warm from the breath of the oven. It rested untouched, as always, near the antechamber window, where morning light would soon fall. The kitchen remained calm. A black cat, the unofficial guardian of the hearth, crept in and leapt silently onto a stool. It curled beside the oven and slept, its ears flicking only when the baker moved too quickly. The scent of baked rye filled the room, a sweet and earthy note that seemed to fold around the furniture, and floor. The baker placed the newly finished loaves on the cooling racks. Their crusts crackled softly as they settled, releasing heat like sighs into the air. He reached for the broom and swept gently around the oven, careful not to disturb the cat. As he moved past the tin once more, he slowed just slightly. Not enough to pause, just enough to notice. There was something comforting in its presence. It was not a mystery he needed to solve. It was a thread woven into the fabric of his work, like the rhythm of kneading or the silence of dawn. The letter was there, simply and quietly, for a day not yet named. In the months that followed, the tin remained unopened, but the baker polished it more often. Sometimes he would speak to it in passing, not with words, but with gestures, a nod, a brush of the sleeve, a glance. It was as if the letter had become part of the ritual of baking, a silent step in the recipe of each day. The flour dust never stopped settling on it. No matter how often it was wiped, it always returned thin, weightless, like memory in physical form. And still, the envelope remained closed. Late one evening, as a spring rain began tapping softly at the window, the baker sat on his stool beside the hearth. The fire had died to embers, and the cat lay stretched long and warm beside it. He looked toward the tin. The thought passed through him again, as it had so many times. Not yet. He closed his eyes. Somewhere in the palace, the emperor sat quietly, watching the dusk settle over the gardens. A loaf rested on its tray, untouched but not forgotten. The great clock waited to chime again. And in the kitchen, the letter waited. 2. For a moment that may never come, or one that was drawing near, no one could say, but it waited all the same. Like bread on the tray, like the crumbs that followed, like time folding quietly upon itself. The palace at night did not sleep. It rested gently, under a veil of quiet that softened every corner. The tall windows no longer carried sunlight, but invited in a silver glow. Moonlight spilled across the marble floors like a dream unfolded, turning the familiar into something almost mythical. The great kitchen, so often alive with footsteps and flickering ovens by day, now lay in hush. And yet it was not empty. Someone always remained. A narrow window near the ceiling let in a slice of moonlight, its beam cutting across the cool flagstone floor. It touched upon the long wooden table where bread was shaped each morning, now wiped clean and left to breathe in the silence. Copper pots hung overhead, unmoving. The hearth, still warm from the evening's baking, emitted a low and steady heat, as if whispering a lullaby to the stones around it. In the far corner of the room, a small cat had curled itself tightly upon an old cushion placed near the oven. Its ears flicked now and then, responding to sounds too subtle for human ears. But mostly it slept, tail wrapped around its body like a comma closing the sentence of the day. The cat did not stir when the wind nudged the shutters or when ash shifted softly in the grate. These were familiar lullabies. Near the doorway, a few trays stood stacked, their surfaces cool and smooth to the touch. A fine dusting of flour lingered, catching the faint light in the air. One could trace a finger through it and leave a quiet message, though no one ever did. The trays waited, not for hands, but for rhythm, for the hour to return when they would be needed again. Until then, they stood in quiet formation, like guardians of a forgotten ritual. Above them, the great clock in the kitchen ticked on. Its hands, slim and deliberate, moved without hurry. The sound was soft, just enough to remind the space of time's passage, but never enough to disturb. Each tick echoed faintly through the room, mingling with the occasional creak of wood or the distant sigh of wind beneath the doors. This was not noise, but atmosphere. Every sound belonged here. The shelves were lined with jars of spices, grains, and dried herbs. Even in stillness, they seemed full of stories of mornings that began in darkness and ended in warmth. Cinnamon bark curled slightly in its jar. Fennel seeds gleamed pale green under the glass. A single bundle of dried lavender lay across the shelf, tied with faded ribbon. It was not used often, but no one moved it. It had become part of the room's memory. A lantern hung just inside the door, unlit now, but its glass panes reflected the moonlight. Its frame cast soft shadows on the wall, tracing delicate patterns onto the stone. In the past, the lantern had guided early footsteps through the kitchen, its glow swinging gently in rhythm with the bearer's breath. Now it rested, waiting, again for the morning's first stirrings. On the work table, someone had left behind a wooden bowl, its interior dusted with flour. A spoon rested inside, the curve of its handle smoothed by years of use. These items were not misplaced. They were simply paused, like pages between readings. Each object in the room had a role to play, even in silence. Nothing here was without intention. The chimney exhaled slowly. Its breath was warm and steady, carrying with it a faint scent of yeast and smoke. It moved through the rafters like a sigh, brushing past old beams and corners, folding itself into the room's quiet. The air itself seemed drowsy, slowed by the hour. No fire burned now, yet the warmth lingered, not heat, but memory of it. Somewhere in the hallway beyond, footsteps might eventually pass. But for now, the world was still. The kitchen held its breath between the hours, suspended in the softness of midnight. There was no need for motion, no purpose for noise. The silence was complete, but never empty. It was filled with the presence of repetition, of work long done and soon to be done again dot above the hearth. A row of hooks held old aprons, folded and waiting. Each one bore traces of flour along the hem, or small tears where years of tying had worn through the weave. There, presence was comforting. They were garments of purpose, of tradition, and they waited quietly, their weight as familiar as the light itself. Not far from the hearth sat a basket of kindling. Though untouched tonight, its placement was precise. No one had to speak of it. Everyone knew it would be there, always just enough wood to begin again. The basket was woven from dark reeds, its handles worn smooth. Its shadow stretched long across the floor, blending with the shadows of chair legs and stool feet. Everything extended into everything else outside. The moon continued its quiet journey across the sky. Its light shifted slightly, casting new lines of silver through the kitchen. And still, the cat slept. The clock ticked. The bowl waited. This was the rhythm of the palace after dark. Nothing stirred, yet everything moved in its own slow, patient way. In this quiet, even the smallest detail held presence. A droplet of wax hardened on a candlestick nearby. The way it curved down the side, like a frozen stream, was beautiful in its own quiet way. No one would clean it until morning, for now it belonged. The room, like a painting, was whole only with every brushstroke intact, and just as the clock reached its quiet hour, a faint creak came from the direction of the pantry door, shifting slightly in its frame. Not enough to open. Just a subtle movement, like the house stretching in its sleep. The sound passed quickly, lost in the gentle hush that followed. No one heard. But the kitchen knew so the night passed. Soft, slow, and full of unspoken things. The warmth beneath the oven faded little by little, but never disappeared. The air stayed full of flour and stories. And everything waited not with impatience, but with readiness. Because dawn would come, the baker would return, and the kitchen, moonlit no longer, would breathe again. The morning sun touched the edges of the kitchen long after its warmth had arrived elsewhere. In this room, the light crept slowly, filtered through old shutters and linen curtains, settling in golden patches along the stone floor. The baker's bench stood exactly where it always had, its surface marked by decades of flour and patience. And resting beside it, near the cupboard where the tins were stored, was the basket. It was a simple thing woven from willow darkened with age and use. The handles had softened from countless lifts, and the base bore the faint curve that came from cradling round loaves again and again. No one could recall when the basket first arrived in the kitchen. It had simply always been there, like the oven, like the wooden spoon with the split handle, like the smell of rye that lived in the walls. It had earned its place not through beauty, but through presence. Each morning, before the dough was shaped, the basket would be gently wiped with a dry cloth. Not to clean it entirely, but to wake it. Flour clung to its edges, collected in tiny corners of the weave, like memories reluctant to be dusted away. Some of the younger apprentices had once asked why the basket wasn't replaced. There were. Newer ones in the storage room, tighter weave, cleaner lines. But the head baker had only smiled. "This one knows the weight of bread," he had said, his voice calm. Over the years, the basket had carried countless loaves, each one placed carefully, side by side, with the same deliberate rhythm. The warmth of the bread would seep into the reeds, and the smell would linger long after the basket was emptied. On days when the palace was especially quiet, snow falling, or mist curling beneath the windowsills, the basket seemed to carry the silence with it, as if even quiet had shape and form. Some said that if you leaned close, you could smell the first loaf ever placed in it. Not its ingredients or freshness, but the memory of that morning, the way the steam rose into the chill, the way the floor creaked beneath the baker's boots, the way the early light filtered through smoke above the oven. Of course, No one truly remembered that day. But the basket did. The baker often ran his hand along its edge before placing the day's loaf inside. It was a habit, not unlike a nod between old friends. He would lift it slowly, never rushing. Even on the busiest mornings, when trays lined the counters and the fire needed feeding, the basket was treated with a kind of reverence. Not sacred, but familiar like a lullaby, hummed without thinking God in time, the basket began to wear along the corners. A few reeds cracked, others loosened. A gentle tear formed near one of the handles, bound with linen thread by a careful hand. But no one called it broken. It was simply aging, the way all trusted things do. Its imperfections were not flaws. They were the places where history had chosen to rest. A young apprentice, recently brought into the kitchen, once offered to mend it fully. She brought tools and new strips of reed. But the head baker had paused, then shook his head. "Let it be," he said softly. "If you change it too much, it won't know what it's carrying." The girl had nodded, placing the tools away, and afterward began brushing the basket with the same quiet respect as seasons passed. New loaves filled the same curve of its base, round ones dusted with rye, longer ones with seeds along the crust. The basket held them all, molding gently to their warmth. It was never overfilled, never hurried. Its shape had grown accustomed to balance, to just the right number of loaves, just the right weight. More than that, and it would protest with a faint creak of the handles. The servants who carried it through the halls knew its sound, a soft rustle against the linen cloth beneath the bread, a tap of reed on stone if it brushed the floor, the light scrape of the handle against a coat sleeve. These were not loud. They were notes in the morning's quiet melody, accompanying the chime of distant clocks and the distant call of doves perched on frosted window sills. Sometimes the basket sat alone on the counter, empty but not forgotten. On those days, its presence was as meaningful as when it carried something. It reminded the kitchen that not all mornings needed bread. Some were for pause, for remembering, for waiting. The basket never minded. It simply waited with them, its empty curve like an open palm. There were stories told about the basket, not written, not official, but passed along between spoonfuls of dough and sips of tea. One spoke of a day when the emperor himself had touched it, lifting the linen to look at the bread beneath. No one knew if it was true, but the idea stayed, tucked between the basket's layers like a folded note. Another story claimed the basket once carried not bread, but a letter placed there, by mistake or perhaps intentionally, during a time when messages were best hidden in plain sight. The letter had vanished by the time it reached the upper floor. No one ever confessed to writing it. No one ever asked who had received it. But from then on, the basket was treated with a shade more mystery. Still, it returned each day to the kitchen, carried in gently, sat down with care. Sometimes the bread was untouched by evening. Other times, a corner would be missing. But the basket never showed surprise. It was steady, and in that steadiness, the kitchen found comfort. Even now, in the hush between daylight and the first chiming hour, the basket sat by the door, ready. It held no loaves yet, but it would. It always did. And when the bread came warm from the oven, shaped with the same rhythm as yesterday and the day before, it would receive it like memory receiving another dream. There were mornings when the air carried something more than cold or warmth, something quieter than sound. On such mornings, the scent of bread faint, warm, and earthy rose gently through the palace corridors, moving slowly like a soft ripple, through velvet-lined halls and stone staircases. It did not announce itself. It arrived with patience, like memory unfolding in the distance. The rye bread, always made first, had a particular smell that lingered longer than the others. Slightly sweet, slightly nutty, and just shy of smoky. It wove itself into the air with practiced subtlety. When the first light touched the window panes of the emperor's study, that scent was already present, as though it had arrived ahead of time. Waiting quietly near the armchair by the fire, rye was not the softest of flours. It made a loaf that resisted the knife slightly, its crust thicker, its crumb denser. But it was dependable, weathered, and filled with something ancient. The baker favored it for that reason. Rye did not shout for attention. It simply held its place, like an old friend who listened more than he spoke. The emperor, too, had his moments with the scent, not because he reached for the bread, but because he noticed when it was missing. Once or twice each year, on stormy days or when snow piled high outside the great gates, the scent would fail to arrive. On those mornings, the emperor's eyes would lift slightly as he stood by the window. He would not move. He would not speak. But the stillness deepened, and that was enough to mark the absence. Most days, however, the scent arrived exactly when it should, not with the chiming of clocks, but with the soft settling of morning. A housemaid carrying linens would pause mid-step, her arms full, and inhale without thinking. A scribe bent over papers would smile faintly, though no one else was in the room. Even the cat that curled near the hearth in the west hallway would twitch its ears, adjust its paws, and settle further into sleep. That was the nature of rye. It did not rouse. It soothed. It was never overwhelming. Even as the crust darkened and the loaf cooled, the scent retained a softness, a reminder perhaps of harvests past, of fields brushed by golden wind, of hands shaping dough without urgency. The scent did not speak of hunger. It spoke of time held gently, then released. There was one moment each day when the scent deepened. It was not when the bread left the oven, or when it was placed into the basket. It happened in transit in the small span between the kitchen door and the turn of the corridor leading toward the emperor's quarters. A brief meeting between warmth and old stone. The hallway, always slightly colder, caused the scent to lift and gather, like breath rising in the chill. And then it dispersed again, continuing on in whispers. Sometimes the scent lingered longer than expected. It would find its way into unused rooms, drift beneath curtains, settle on windowsills. Servants would notice it hours later, wondering if a loaf had been forgotten somewhere. But it was never the bread, only the air, holding on to what it loved for a little while longer. In the scriptorium, where the emperor kept certain maps and aged letters, the scent would find its way in through narrow vents and old cracks in the walls. The parchment and ink did not resist it. Instead, they accepted the fragrance as part of the morning, as naturally as the slow turning of pages or the faint creak of a leather-bound spine. The emperor himself never commented on the scent. He did not seek it out, but he also never avoided it. On especially still days, when the sun took longer to climb and the shadows lingered near the baseboards, he could sometimes be found standing motionless beside the antechamber table. The bread would sit there, untouched as always, but his eyes would rest gently on it, not in judgment, not in hunger, simply in presence. And now and then, something else would happen. A faint huff of air through his nose, almost imperceptible. A pause between breaths, as if acknowledging, without words, that he remembered the smell, that it had once been more than background, that it had once, perhaps, meant comfort. For those working in the palace, the scent had become a kind of timekeeping, not like the ticking of clocks or the movement of light across the floors, but a subtler rhythm. When the rye reached the third corridor, the linens would be hung. When it drifted into the music room, the harpsichord would be uncovered. When it reached the chapel alcove, the doors would be opened just slightly to let the morning air in. The baker, of course, never chased the scent. He released it, then let it go. It was never meant to be owned. Like steam from a teacup or smoke from a candle, it belonged to the spaces in between, to the corridors and corners, to the silent breath of stone and wood. On a morning not unlike any other, the youngest apprentice noticed a change. The scent was there, familiar and soft, but beneath it was something slightly sharper, a note of crust just beginning to char, a hint of darkness at the edge. She didn't speak. She simply watched as the loaf was turned out onto the cooling. Cloth, steam lifting upward in elegant spirals. Later that day, as she swept the stone steps near the west wing, she caught that same note again, barely there, but enough to pause her. The rye was changing, she thought, or perhaps the air was, or perhaps she was. But whatever it was not unwelcome. Just dot different, the kind of change that doesn't disturb, only deepens dot, and so the scent of rye continued its gentle work, threading itself through the palace, marking the hours not with bells or inked records, but with a language of softness. The emperor did not speak of it. The servants did not question it, but they all lived in it, moved through it, trusted it. The bread would cool, the scent would fade, the sun would climb, and by evening it would all begin again. There was a rhythm to the palace that did not come from clocks, nor from bells, but from footsteps soft and unhurried, gliding across the cool, warm tiles of its floors. These steps never hurried, never startled. They seemed to echo more in memory than in sound. Like gentle thoughts crossing the mind, they came and went with no beginning or end. The palace, in its great quiet, listened to each one as if it were a verse in a poem that had been recited for centuries. The floor beneath these steps was made of large stone tiles, cool even in summer and smooth with the wear of time. The marble was a soft pattern of pale gray and ivory, and where morning light touched it, it seemed to glow faintly, like old moonlight caught in stone. With each step there came a subtle shift in tone, not a creak, but a whisper. Foot against tile, cloth against air. A language not spoken, yet always understood. The emperor's steps were the most familiar of all. They moved with the patience of someone who had long since learned that every corner of the palace would wait for him. He did not walk with command, but with calm. Each footfall was placed gently, as if he were not crossing stone, but remembering it. His steps made no proclamation. They carried only presence. When he walked alone in the early hours, there were times he would pause mid-corridor, not for thought or direction, but simply to feel the stillness around him. It was as if the tiles beneath his feet, the curtains, billowing slightly in the hallways, the paintings gazing softly from their frames, all were part of a quiet ceremony that required nothing more than his continued movement. Servants, too, knew the floor. They learned its small irregularities, the spots where a tile dipped ever so slightly, or where the morning sun made the stone briefly warm to the touch. They did not look down, but they felt it in the soles of their shoes, in the tilt of their weight. Walking the palace was like tracing a map already drawn within them. Some corridors had echoes that lingered a little longer. Others softened sound so well that even footsteps seemed to vanish. In one hallway, near the conservatory, the acoustics played tricks, making it sound as though one walked behind oneself, as if the past followed with its own careful pace. No one found this unsettling. It was simply another voice in the quiet choir of the palace. There were days when the emperor would take the longer route to his reading room, not because he needed more time, but because he enjoyed the particular echo of that pathway. The sound his steps made through the stone archways there was different, rounded, deeper, almost like the memory of a bell. He would close his eyes as he walked, not to sleep, but to listen more completely. In a side corridor, there was one loose tile, just one. It did not shift or crack, but it had a different note, as though it carried more air beneath it. No one repaired it. It was not broken. It was simply distinct, like a slight accent in an otherwise familiar voice. When the emperor's heel landed there, it was almost like punctuation, a soft period at the end of a sentence spoken without words. On stormy mornings, the steps sounded heavier, cushioned by the dampness in the air. But even then, they were gentle. The hush of rain outside mirrored the hush within. The stone floors accepted each step as they always had. Rain never reached these inner corridors, but the feeling of wetness somehow did carried in the rhythm. Of feet, the brush of a wet cloak, the scent of earth trailing after evening steps were different. Not hurried, but wrapped in a different light. Shadows stretched longer, and each step seemed to float in amber. The emperor would sometimes retrace his path from morning, each corridor now quieter, each tile a little cooler. There was no destination, only return. And in that return, a kind of peace. The bread remained on its tray in the antechamber, untouched, yet not unnoticed. The floor there had a particularly smooth pattern circles, faintly etched into the marble, nearly invisible unless one knew to look. It was said the design had been chosen centuries ago to mark a place of pause. And so, each morning, the emperor's steps would slow as he passed, though he never stopped for long. The loaf waited. His steps moved on when the cat crossed the hallway. Its pause made no sound at all, but one could always tell it had passed, for the stillness that followed was deeper, as if the floor, too, had paused to listen. Even the smallest life left its mark, not through sound, but through motion. The palace did not require grand gestures, only presence. Children of visiting nobility would sometimes tiptoe, trying to avoid making any sound at all. Their games of silence became a kind of rite, and in those rare moments, the tiles echoed with a lighter joy. But even that joy knew its bounds, for soon the hush would return, and with it, the slow, measured rhythm of those who belonged to the place more deeply. At night, when no steps were heard, the memory of movement still lingered. The floor held it like warmth long after the fire had gone out. The emperor, asleep in his chamber, would sometimes dream of walking not toward anything, not away, but simply walking. His dream steps were no different from those of the day, quiet, steady, real. And so the palace remained a place of footsteps, not loud or urgent, but soft and constant. The stone floor was more than a surface. It was a listener, a keeper of sound, a memory beneath every soul. And as the days passed, the rhythm endured. The bread stayed on its tray. The clock chimed softly in the distance, and the footsteps continued echoing through the quiet heart of a palace that never rushed and never forgot. There was a room in the palace that no one could quite remember entering. It did not appear on any official map, nor did it have a door through which one might pass. And yet it was always there, nestled somewhere along the quieter corridors between the east wing and the inner cloisters. It existed like a thought, half remembered, more sensed than seen, more known by presence than proof that no servant had ever been assigned to it, no visitor had ever been led inside. Yet those who moved through the palace knew it in the way one knows a familiar scent or a melody hummed in another room. The room without doors was not hidden, nor was it announced. It simply was. Its windows, if it had them, never showed the day's passing light, and yet the room was never dark. A soft glow always drifted from beneath its seams, and amber warmth that spilled just barely into the hallway tiles. It was not electric or harsh, nor the flickering kind of a candle. Rather, it was steady, like the glow of a hearth tended with care. The curious thing about the room was not just its light, but its consistency. Each morning, as predictably as the bread appeared on its porcelain tray, a fresh loaf would also be seen just within this room's reach. not placed upon a table or tucked upon a shelf, but resting gently near the threshold visible. Only when one glanced at precisely the right angle dot, no one was seen placing the bread. No footsteps led to or from it. It bore no note, no sign, no wrapper. And yet, like the sunrise or the first bell of morning, it was simply there, warm, whole, untouched. One might have expected such a phenomenon to invite questions, to spark a flurry of curiosity among the palace staff, but it did not. For those who moved through the long hallways and stairwells of the estate, the room was simply accepted. Just as the gardens grew in symmetrical silence, just as the clocks chimed in staggered unison, the room without doors had become another soft certainty in a world built on hushed repetition. Some thought it a storage space. Others whispered that it was a room built by mistake, walled in during a reconstruction, and now left as a sealed fragment of history. But these were only ideas, never voiced too firmly. The room had a kind of dignity that discouraged explanation. To reduce it to logic felt impolite, even invasive. The emperor, too, passed it often. His footsteps never faltered, his gaze never lingered. And yet, in the moments when his path aligned with the room's faint glow, one might notice a change, not in expression, but in breath. A soft pause, a drawn-out exhale, a flicker of remembrance. Perhaps on mornings when the palace was especially quiet, when fog pressed gently against the window panes and the air felt thick with waiting delight. From the room seemed a little brighter, not dazzling, but warmer, as if reacting to the hush. Those were the days when the loaf appeared to sit taller, its crust more golden, its presence more pronounced. A few of the younger servants, early in their tenure, had attempted to find an entrance. They would tap the walls, trace the patterns of the molding, even pace back and forth with ears tuned for a draft or hollow echo, but nothing yielded. The walls were solid, the corners tight. Eventually, the search would tire, not from frustration, but from a strange sense of contentment. The room didn't wish to be found. That much was clear. And that, in itself, was enough. Sometimes a small item would appear alongside the bread. Folded cloth napkin, a single white feather, or a sprig of dried lavender. Never anything jarring. Never anything out of place. Each object seemed to fit the language of the space. Quiet, thoughtful, slow dot, it became custom, unspoken, and soft. For passing attendants to nod slightly when near the room. Not as a greeting, but as a gesture of acknowledgement. It was as though the room itself held memory, or perhaps carried someone else's thoughts. And to ignore it felt like overlooking a sleeping cat or forgetting to water a plant's small acts. Of negligence that chipped away at gentleness. In time, no one attempted to understand the room. They accepted it as they did the tides of weather or the bloom of lavender in the lower gardens, part of the palace's breath, part of its mood. Some believed the bread inside remained forever warm, never going stale. Others thought the loaf changed daily, replaced by unseen hands. There were theories, of course, shared in quiet kitchens or beside dim hallway lamps. Some said the room was a resting place for an old cook, long since gone, whose spirit still baked in memory. Others believed it was a gift to the emperor, a room of solitude shaped by longing. But none of these were told with urgency or certainty. They were offered like lullabies, stories to rest upon, not to resolve. The emperor never asked about the room. No records listed it, no cleaners were sent to tend to it. And yet, not a speck of dust ever gathered near its light. No insect wandered into its glow. The air nearby always carried a faint warmth, mingled with the scent of something soft, perhaps bread, perhaps time. On one rare winter morning, the light did not appear. The hallway remained dim, its usual flicker absent. Yet the loaf was still, there resting just so, beside the place where the glow would have been. its crust slightly darker than usual, its scent faintly spiced. No one disturbed it. The absence of light was not a lack, merely a variation, and the next morning the glow returned, steady as ever. Nothing more was said in the grand stillness of the palace. The room without doors remained one of its gentlest mysteries, a quiet gesture in a place already full of silence. The loaf continued to appear. The emperor continued to walk past. The attendants continued to nod and so the story of the room endured, not through record or retelling, but through presence, through a glow that waited without calling, and a loaf that appeared without fail, a ritual without explanation, and therefore, perhaps, one of the truest kind. In a field remembered by no map and spoken of in no formal account, wheat once swayed in golden ripples under a forgiving sky. It was the kind of place that only surfaces in the hush between waking and sleep, the liminal space where memory and imagination overlap like light on linen. And perhaps this place never truly existed. Or perhaps it was where everything began. The land was not remarkable. No monument stood, no boundary stones marked its edges. But the soil was soft, and the wind was gentle. In the late afternoons, the sun cast long shadows across the rows of wheat, and those shadows moved with a rhythm that echoed breath itself. Birds swept lazily overhead, their wings barely disturbing the sky. Everything here seemed to exist in a state of restful waiting. A boy once walked these fields, or so the story goes. Barefoot, with a wicker basket dangling from one hand, he stepped carefully between the rows, the wheat whispering softly against his legs. He was small, perhaps no older than 10, but moved with a kind of quiet responsibility, as though the simple act of gathering meant something more. In the basket, already nestled like sleeping animals, were the heads of grain he had gathered. Some still wore their husks like veils. There was a rhythm to his steps, a patient pause as he stooped, examined, plucked. Not everything was taken. Only those stalks that leaned just so, ripe but not weary, full but not fading. He carried no scythe, no tool, only his hands. He moved as one does in a place long known without thought, but not without care. A farmhouse might have stood at the edge of this field, shaded by old trees whose trunks had gone hollow with age. And within that house, a kitchen. And in that kitchen, a woman, perhaps his mother, or perhaps simply someone who knew him well enough to wait without asking. She kneaded dough with practiced hands, her fingers dusted in flour, her sleeves rolled above her elbows. A warm smell drifted through the windows, heavy with yeast and thyme. Or maybe there was no house. Maybe the field stood alone, and the boy simply gathered because it was morning, and the sun was warm, and the wind had said, "Now." It's easy, in the silence of the palace, to imagine the emperor remembering such a place, not as a vivid scene, not with detail or clarity, but as a feeling, a slant of light, the brush of wheat, the soft ache of distance. Perhaps he had never been there at all, and yet each morning a loaf appeared. Each morning the air carried that same quiet purpose. It would not be strange if the memory of a boy gathering grain had followed him into old age, like a scent caught in cloth. In the fields, harvest was not an event. It was a process slow, seasonal, as dependent on stillness as it was on sun. And even when the grain was gathered, it did not rush into bread. It rested first. It was ground, sifted, touched by hands and breath. It passed from basket to sack, from sack to bowl, from bowl to table, all without haste. At times the boy would stop and lie down in the wheat, letting the golden stalks curve gently around him like an embrace. He would close his eyes and listen to the bees murmuring somewhere nearby, to the soft hush of seed heads brushing together, to the deep, slow voice of the earth itself, always speaking, never demanding. In those moments, he was neither laborer nor child. He was simply part of the field, another piece of its soft, breathing memory. One might wonder whether the emperor's ritual with bread was truly about eating at all, or whether it was, in some way, an act of remembering. Not a specific event, but a state of being, a return to rhythm, to silence, to slowness. The bread was never cut, never consumed. It simply existed, like the field itself, complete in its own still presence. No portraits lined the edges of that imagined countryside. No flags fluttered above its trees. But there was a kind of royalty there, in the simplicity of motion, in the honesty of the soil. The wheat bowed naturally, without force. The wind offered its counsel freely, without demand. If this was the emperor's kingdom once, he ruled it not with decree, but with footsteps. The basket the boy carried may have frayed at the edges. It may have belonged to someone before him, woven of reeds gathered from a riverbank long dried. It creaked slightly with each step, a sound that would later become part of memory's fabric. When he set it down, the shape of the wheat inside shifted gently, settling as if it too needed rest. At the palace, in the quietest hours, the emperor sometimes paused in the gallery where a small painting hung, not of a field, not of a boy, but of a single stalk of wheat, rendered with painstaking simplicity. The paint had faded, the edges of the frame were nicked, but the stem still stood tall, golden and clean against its dark backdrop. He would stand there a while, not moving, not thinking exactly, but remembering without words. The field, if it ever truly existed, likely grew wild now, if not taken by forest, then by silence. Perhaps the wind still passes through, bending the tall grass in gestures that mirror ancient rhythms. Perhaps the boy, wherever he is, still walks barefoot across the earth in dreams, his basket swinging softly, his heart tuned to a song older than memory. And perhaps each time a fresh loaf is laid gently on porcelain in a palace far away, a field stirs slightly under the morning sun. A golden echo, heard only by those who remember not with the mind, but with breath. There was one rule never spoken aloud, yet honored by all regarding the bread placed each morning on its porcelain tray. It was never to be sliced. Not once in the passing years, through seasons of frost and sun, had a knife touched the crust. It remained whole, round, concealed, like a vessel of stillness set down in a world that refused to hurry. Even as the palace changed in subtle ways, the bread did not. Paint flaked from cornices. Upholstery wore smooth from the pressure of decades. Clocks ticked a little slower. But the loaf always appeared, and it always stayed whole. It became a symbol, not just of habit, but of something softer, more elusive, a quiet pact with time itself. The emperor never explained this practice. Those who prepared the bread did not ask. New servants, when trained, were told gently but firmly, the loaf is not to be touched. If asked why, they were only told, because. That's how it's always been. And for most, that was enough. The crust, always golden but never cracked, had a thickness that suggested it could endure anything, weather, forgetfulness, even longing. It seemed to protect something, though none could say what. Inside, there, might be softness, warmth, perhaps even sweetness. Or perhaps there was nothing at all. But no one ever looked. It became, over time, a kind of mirror, not of the one who made it, but of the one who passed it by each morning. The emperor would pause sometimes, eyes resting on the tray, as though measuring not the bread, but the stillness it offered. In that moment, the loaf became a kind of threshold, one he chose not to cross. In the quieter corners of the palace, whispers emerged. Not gossip, but the low musings of those who swept floors and polished banisters. They speculated gently, not with curiosity, but with affection. One said it was a memory the emperor refused to disturb. Another said it marked time, as candles do burning down in silence, without needing to be lit. There was a theory, half whimsy, half belief, that the bread was not really made of flour at all, but of years. That each loaf was baked not in the kitchen ovens, but in the turning of the day itself. That to slice into one would be to lose something irreversible, a rhythm, a pause, a breath of stillness. In the emperor's study, a journal sat unopened, on the lowest shelf, bound in soft leather, worn at the corners. Its spine bore no title. It was rumored to contain thoughts never shared, written by the emperor in his younger years, when words still seemed necessary. On one page, or so a former secretary once said, was a line that read, "Bread keeps time still." No one ever verified it. The journal was left untouched, as if it too had a crust that should not be broken. There were moments when the emperor himself seemed almost tempted. Once, during a particularly long morning, he lingered near the tray longer than usual. His hand hovered, not reaching, not pulling away, just there. But in the end, he turned and left, his footsteps returning to Fu, their soft pattern against the stone. The loaf remained whole, glinting slightly the morning light. Sometimes it felt as if the bread was not just part of the palace, but the palace was shaped around it. Rooms opened into one another with gentle transitions. Curtains shifted with slow grace. Time moved not with urgency, but with permission. The bread was the center of it all, a silent axis around which everything else quietly revolved. The tradition continued. Even when a new baker was apprenticed, he was told kindly, without urgency, that his hands were making something sacred, not for consumption, but for memory, not for hunger, but for rhythm. And the boy, though young, understood. He shaped each loaf carefully, pressing his fingers to the dough with a reverence that surprised him. It felt less like baking and more like listening. The crust, when finished, bore the gentlest sheen. Not glossy, not dull, just enough to catch the light in a way that hinted at warmth within. The boy once asked the older baker why it mattered so much, if no one would ever eat it. The older man had smiled and replied softly, "Because someone sees it." In the grand hall, beneath tapestries woven with fading threads of gold and rose, the emperor sometimes passed a mural that depicted the harvest. Men and women carrying bundles of grain, their faces calm and sunlit. Among them, a child with a basket of wheat, walking quietly, looking down. His features were blurred with time, but there was something familiar in his posture, a quiet purpose, a hush in movement. The emperor would stop there now and then, gazing at the child. He did not smile nor sigh, but his shoulders would settle slightly, and the hush around him deepened, like a room exhaling. Perhaps the bread reminded him of that image, or perhaps the image reminded him of the bread. Either way, something passed between them in silence. No ceremonies marked the placing of the loaf. No records were kept. And yet it persisted, day after day, a quiet defiance of decay, a soft monument to repetition. Even the insects, who might have disturbed it, stayed away. Even the dust seemed reluctant to settle upon its surface. To the outside world, it would have seemed strange, unnecessary. But within the palace, the unbroken crust was a constant, a quiet companion to the ticking clocks, to the muted rustle of silk, to the shifting light on marble floors. It held the shape of continuity, a softness never touched, a center never seemed out. And as the day wore on and the light shifted, the loaf remained, waiting without needing. It was not consumed. It was not questioned. It simply was. Tomorrow there would be another. And the crust, once again, would remain unbroken. The ovens were still warm when the baker arrived that morning, though no fire had been lit since the evening before. It was his final day, no announcement, no farewell. He moved through the kitchen as he always had, sleeves rolled, hands dusted. with flour before the sun had risen above the distant trees. He stood for a moment, his hand resting on the long-handled peel, the same tool he had used for decades. It leaned lightly against the hearth, as though it, too, knew its time was nearly over. He did not rush. He never had. The dough had already been prepared the night before, its round shape resting beneath a linen cloth. Rising in quiet sleep as light seeped in from the high windows, the baker moved with slow intention. He measured not with tools, but with memory. A pinch here, a brush of water there. His hands knew what the recipe did not. It was not the ingredients that made the bread, but the rhythm. His fingers pressed into the soft surface with care, shaping the crust to a subtle curve that would catch the morning light just so. He hummed a tune that had no name, just a few notes repeated, the same one he had always hummed when finishing a loaf for the emperor. The room held its breath, listening not to the song, but to the steadiness of its presence. Even the utensils and wooden counters seemed to settle into stillness, paying quiet homage to this final sacred ritual. This loaf, like the others, was never meant to be eaten. It would rest on its tray, whole and untouched, a companion to the day's beginning. But today's loaf held something else. Not a farewell, exactly just a deeper stillness, a soft slowing, a final breath drawn through flour and warmth. There was no signature to mark it, no change in shape or weight, yet the loaf seemed fuller somehow, not in size but in memory. When it was finished, the baker placed the loaf gently on the cloth-covered board. He stood for a moment longer, studying the crust. It was smooth and whole, just as it always had been. But he noticed a line of light along the edge that hadn't been there before, a softness in the shape that seemed to echo something perhaps. His own reflection, or perhaps just the memory of countless mornings now folded behind him. Outside, the palace stirred gently. No one knew this loaf was the last he would make. There was no announcement, no ceremony, only the quiet rhythm of time, unbroken. The corridors, as always, filled slowly with warmth and breath. The golden light pooled against stone, silent and soft. A young apprentice stood in the far corner of the kitchen, watching. He had been learning for months silently, patiently, never daring to ask why the bread was made each morning, only how. He had practiced shaping the loaves with the same reverence, though his hands were still unsure. He had not yet made the morning bread himself, but he would. Soon. The baker turned to him now, not with words, but with a nod, a gesture full of weight and tenderness. Then he reached into a cupboard and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped parcel. Inside was a notebook, frayed at the corners, its pages yellowed. It was not a recipe book, exactly more like a collection of habits. Notes on flour texture, on the feel of air in the room, on the sound a crust made when it cooled. He handed it to the apprentice, who received it with both hands. In the stillness that followed, neither spoke. The oven crackled softly as the last warmth faded. A bird chirped beyond the stone walls, a bright sound quickly swallowed by the heavy hush of the palace grounds. The kitchen, for all its quiet, felt fuller in that moment than it ever had before. Later that morning, the tray was placed in its usual spot. The porcelain gleamed. The loaf rested upon it, perfect and whole. The clock chimed in its familiar tone, and somewhere deep in the palace the emperor paused, as he always did. He did not know that the loaf had been shaped by hands for the last time. He did not need to. It was not the hands that mattered, but the care, the ritual, the continuity. In a palace shaped by silence, such changes arrive not like thunder, but like mist. And the apprentice? He began the next morning early, alone but not uncertain. He moved with careful hands, each motion recalling the ones he had watched 100 times. The bread he shaped was not identical, but it carried the same weight, the same silence. In time, his hands would remember on their own. His breath slowed, steady with purpose. His eyes followed the kneading pattern. He was not imitating anymore. He was becoming. The old baker walked the garden path that day, his apron folded beneath. One arm. He did not look back at the palace. He did not need to. Behind him, the rhythm continued, soft and steady. And on the tray, beneath the quiet light of morning, the final loaf he had shaped remained uncut, still whole, still waiting Dot, and tomorrow another would rest there in its place, new, yet the same. The emperor would walk past it once more, never touching, never speaking. But perhaps, if one looked closely, they might see a flicker of knowing in his eyes. A quiet recognition that something had passed a breath, a moment, a memory. The bread would stay unbroken. The silence would remain. And in that quiet, something eternal would continue to rise. In the final hours of another quiet day, the palace softened once more into shadows. The wind outside had stilled, and the evening air turned cool, curling gently through the stone corridors like a memory. In the great hallways and quiet chambers, candlelight flickered steadily, casting golden ovals onto the time-worn floors. The light did not seek to illuminate, only to soothe Dot throughout the palace. Everything held its breath. Curtains no longer fluttered. The faint ticking of clocks grew, more noticeable. Even the footsteps of distant servants moved with a hush, as though the walls themselves had asked for quiet. Time, too, seemed to slow, stretching itself between moments, like soft fabric pulled between hands. The emperor sat alone in the small library near his chambers. He had been there for a long while, unmoving, gazing not at a page or an object, but at the middle distance where light faded into shadow. The hearth nearby glowed faintly with low burning embers, its warmth just enough to take the chill out of the room. His robe, trimmed in velvet, lay still around him. There was no crown tonight, no regalia, only the hum of old thoughts echoing. Softly inside the quiet of a long life, Dot, in the corner of the room, the porcelain tray held its loaf. Perfectly baked, with its crust still golden and warm, it sat untouched. No crumbs this time, no faint indentations. Just the loaf, whole and complete, as though it were waiting for someone who had forgotten to arrive. The tray itself reflected a sliver of candlelight, a silent witness to the night's steady hush. Dot, the emperor's gaze, eventually found the bread. His eyes did not widen or narrow. They simply rested on the loaf, the way one might look at a familiar tree outside a window, a part of the world, a shape that had always been there. The room smelled faintly of parchment, beeswax, and flower scents that together formed something like memory. Elsewhere, in the kitchens below, the ovens had long since cooled. The bakers had gone home, their work done, their day folded gently into night. The apprentice, now a young man, had covered the kneading bench with linen and closed the flour bins with care. He paused before leaving, his hand resting for a moment on the old wooden table, a gesture of respect, or perhaps farewell. Dot, above, the halls darkened. Only the sconces near the emperor's study still burned, their light dimmed by layers of wax and time. Paintings watched from their walls, their expressions as they had always been, composed, knowing, eternal. And down the corridor, in the antechamber, a single grandfather clock let out its deep, slow chime. 10 o'clock. The sound was not loud. It was simply there, like a breath between thoughts. A few snowflakes began to fall outside, lazy and soft. They landed silently on the ledges and railings of the eastern wing. The gardens, long since put to sleep for the season, accepted the snow as gently as they accepted sunlight in spring. A fountain, half frozen, or a quiet collar of ice. Inside, the air felt heavier. not oppressive, but full as if the palace had taken one final inhale and was now holding it. Every object, every space seemed to be listening. There was nothing to hear but the shifting of fire and the nearly imperceptible creak of old beans adjusting to the cold. The emperor rose, slowly, from his chair. His hands, though aged, moved with careful grace. He did not glance at the bread again, but he passed by it as he left the library. His fingers brushed the edge of the tray, not in purpose, but in passing. A silent acknowledgement. A thank you. Perhaps, or merely a gesture learned by the body over years. He stepped into the hallway. The stone beneath his feet was cool, but not cold. The air brushed his skin like silk. He walked with the same measured pace as always. There was no urgency, no fatigue, just movement. A man continuing the same path he had always walked as he moved through the corridor. The candles on the wall seemed to tilt toward him slightly, as if to offer more of their light. Shadows followed his robe, but never overtook it. His figure, tall and composed, was both part of the palace and, apart from it, a guest in his own legacy. In the room without doors, the light remained steady. The loaf still appeared each morning, placed by no visible hand. Tonight, the room was empty, save for the flicker of light and the hush of ancient stone. The walls knew something, but they did not tell. Back in the emperor's private chamber, the bed had been turned down, the covers drawn with precision. A book lay closed on the knitstand. The fire here had died down, but its coals glowed with a last lazy heat. A chair near the fireplace held a robe draped over one arm. The room was ready, though no one waited. The emperor walked past it all and stepped onto the small balcony that faced the garden. The snow had picked up now, falling more thickly, but still without sound. It caught in his hair, on his sleeves, on the stone balustrade. He rested his hands there, looking out not at anything in particular, but simply into the whiteness. He stood for a long time. Somewhere behind him, a candle reached its end. Its wick curled inward, and the flame gave one final flutter before disappearing. A thin wisp of smoke rose and vanished into the quiet. And now, dear listener, let us leave the emperor here, standing beneath a sky that does not speak, watching snow fall on a world that does not hurry. Let this moment remain just as it is. No answers, no explanations. Only the softness of repetition, the comfort of a habit never questioned. Let your thoughts settle like the flakes outside, gentle and without urgency. Let your breath slow to match the hush of rooms lit by fading light. Perhaps there is a loaf of bread waiting somewhere in your dreams, whole, warm, untouched. May your dreams rise slowly, like steam from a quiet oven. May your thoughts grow, soft as flower in the morning air. May sleep take you gently. Good night, and until next time, beside the sleepy fireside.